trying to take me to task, cause I don't wanna wear a mask or take a vaccine that could maybe make me die. They got no scientific evidence to back that crap up. All they do is feed us lie after lie. That's why I will not comply.
Hello, I'm Renton McLaughlin in New Zealand. If you want to kill a person, I doubt you'd waste your time beating up their big toe. Once you've dealt with that, the person's still alive. Why not go for the jugular and do the deed decisively? To change the illustration, if you want to get rid of a tree, there are a number of ways you could do it. You could take off every leaf one at a time, then the twigs, then the branches, and so on. Or you could take a chainsaw to the base of the tree and cut the whole lot down all at once. Doing it this way, you don't need to bother about the individual leaves or twigs or branches, because by cutting it off at the roots, they're all dealt with at the same time. To extend this illustration further, there's a big idea, a really big idea, held by zillions, which is represented by a tree. I imagine you've seen it many times, the evolutionary tree of life, the only illustration that Charles Darwin had in his 1859 book on the origin of species by means of natural selection or preservation of favoured races in the struggle for life. They used long titles for books back then. Darwin does not appear to have been a crash hot artist, so here is a later drawing of the same idea done with better graphics. This drawing encapsulates an idea that has persuaded many, an idea that says once there was no life, then life began, represented by the base of the tree, which then developed and evolved, much like a tree, with main branches and secondary branches out to twigs and leaves, the leaves representing all the forms of life we find on Earth today. The twigs and branches represent all the ancestors of present-day life forms right back to the beginning of life, the family tree of living things. Now, let's say you disagree with this idea and want to refute it. You could bring arguments to bear against it from all the sciences and spend a huge amount of intellectual effort and argumentation questioning such things as speciation, population, genetics, homologies, fossil claims for this or that, missing links, uniformitarianism in geologic processes, radiometric dating methods, and so on, which may be all very interesting. Actually, a lot of it is very interesting. But these don't actually get to the guts of the issue, and a huge amount of effort could be expended with very little return. The idea this tree represents is vulnerable, not at the twigs and leaves, but at the trunk, at the roots. If it could be shown that it's impossible to get life with its code and information and machines from non-life, from raw chemistry, by sheer dumb luck, then the whole of this big idea is uprooted, lock, stock and barrel, to mix metaphors. It's like a running race. If all the competitors are dead on the starting blocks, the race can't occur. End of story. No matter how persuasive any evidence up the tree is, if the tree could not start growing, then the whole thing is a fantasy. And this despite it being a really big idea, held by untold millions, with innumerable scientists spending all their lives assuming the tree did in fact start growing. And so it is with all this COVID stuff that has brought the Western world to its knees, introducing tyranny, segregation, medical apartheid, division among families and friends, within businesses and churches, along with severe limitations of basic freedoms, economic catastrophe and collapse, and hundreds of thousands not getting the medical treatment they need because diagnosis and surgeries have been delayed, deferred or cancelled. Or people are simply putting off going to medical centres and hospitals. Not to mention the immeasurable psychological damage done to children, or the adverse reactions, including many deaths caused by the so-called vaccines. 2 short years ago, who would have dreamed any of this possible? A narrative has been spun of a deadly virus out of China, and virtually everyone has accepted this narrative, spending billions of man-hours and billions of dollars to combat the perceived threat. It's in your face all the time. Mask mandates make sure of that and dominates all of life. Mainstream media repeats it ad nauseum, ramping up the fear. And it's not just outfits like World Health Organization or the Centers for Disease Control in the US or governments and health authorities in countries all around the world, which all sing from the same song sheet, repeating the same dire warnings many times almost word for word. You could almost be forgiven for suspecting it was all planned. Even most of those who oppose the developing tyranny and the medical mandates accept the basic narrative also, poring over statistics about cases and deaths and vulnerability to the virus. Where did it come from? Was it manufactured? What about gain of function and whether or not we'll all get it, etc. I've observed Facebook discussions between people very concerned about the violation of what we've taken to be fundamental human rights, about the violation of free speech and privacy, the violation of the right to travel and meet with others, the violation of the requirement for informed consent to medical procedures, and the freedom to choose not to accept such procedures without facing manipulation, intimidation, ridicule, exclusion, and censure. And yet all the time, it's as though there's an elephant in the room that's being studiously ignored by all. I've recently been to meetings of people very opposed to governmental overreach and the vaccine mandates and policies, etc. And yet all the discussion over several hours at a recent such meeting presupposed the basic narrative. I made a plea for those present to question the foundational assumptions of the narrative. If we did, it would change the way we talk about it, because the very words we use to address it comes from, determines and reinforces how we think about it. Whoever controls the language surrounding an issue controls how people think about that issue. Using such language also locks us into a shared narrative with those we disagree with, which means we will only argue with them about details, not substance, the colour of the wallpaper, but not the foundations of the house. None of these discussions go to the root of the issue. It's like we're content to tear off twigs and leaves but willing to leave the tree standing, to accept the narrative as though it's settled science and beyond question. I produced a video a few weeks ago entitled CV19 4 Basic Assumptions. I did so because I'm not prepared to accept the narrative without question. To repeat those 4 basic assumptions. 1. That the virus SARS-CoV-2 exists and that its existence has been verified through it being isolated, purified. Look into it and you will find this has not happened. Around 120 government agencies, health boards, etc. from around the world have been asked via official information requests for documented proof that this claimed virus has been isolated, purified, and none have come up with the goods. 2. That this virus causes a deadly disease, COVID-19. To establish disease causality is in many situations a difficult thing to do. To establish causality, you need to have isolated and identified the cause, which in this case is claimed to be a virus. But no one has the virus. 3. That the genome of this virus has been obtained and sequenced. To obtain a whole genome, you again need to have the virus to extract it from. With no virus, no such extraction has been done. 4. That the PCR test used worldwide to identify those who supposedly have the disease is a legitimate diagnostic tool for infectious diseases. This was explicitly denied by the inventor of PCR, Kary Mullis, who got a Nobel Prize for his invention. I think it's about time these 4 assumptions were introduced into discussions. I'm aware that for a number of reasons it's a bridge too far for most people. Perhaps because it calls into question long-held views about sickness and health, even questioning the field of virology, which has been entrenched in the medical establishment for around 130 years, and elevated to a godlike status. I say, if it questions virology, then so be it. I have no stake in it. And actually, virtually all but virologists and pharmaceutical companies, which make their billions largely on the back of claimed viruses, would be totally unaffected by its demise. Perhaps it's because it seems like a daunting task to delve into matters we've taken for granted but actually know little about, and which can appear to be highly technical and beyond our pay grade. Perhaps it's because we simply haven't acquired the intellectual tools for such a task and prefer to just accept what others, the so-called experts, tell us without question. Perhaps we don't know what the questions to ask are to help us in our search. This is quite understandable. It took me months to work out such questions myself. I don't anticipate all this stuff going away in a hurry. The trajectory has continually been towards greater control, manipulation and loss of freedoms. It was initially 3 weeks to flatten the curve, and now in New Zealand it's effectively up to compulsory vaccination. Not explicitly, but practically so. No jab, no job, and no access to many businesses. And vaccine passports, with social credit systems like Communist China has, waiting in the wings where all of life is controlled, and you are given merit or demerit points depending on behaviour acceptable or not, to the whim of a controlling government, and rewarded or punished accordingly. Other countries have introduced explicitly compulsory vaccinations with draconian fines and other penalties for those who do not comply. Greece has just said that people over 60 who do not get vaxxed will be fined $114 a month, the President calling it an act of justice for the vaccinated, and an act of encouragement, not repression, and not a punishment but a health fee. Sounds like newspeak straight out of 1984. The head of the EU Commission has even suggested doing away with the post-World War II Nuremberg Code, devised explicitly in the wake of the Nazi medical experimentation to protect us from just such measures. Thousands of highly qualified people have been fired, marginalised, treated as lepers, second-class citizens, their productivity, initiative and creativity lost to the wider community and the nation. 2 classes have been established, a New Zealand version of apartheid, with segregation being implemented even by churches, for goodness sake. And the New Zealand Prime Minister smiles and says, yep, that is what it is. People need to wake up and realise this is not about health, but control. And a government that has decided it does not need to be constrained by any law or court ruling, nor any of the established charters such as the New Zealand Bill of Rights. So there are 2 things here: the claim of a deadly medical situation and increasing government tyranny. The latter has used the former to mask and justify the tyranny, and bamboozle the population into compliance and acceptance of the tyranny. Both issues need to be addressed, but one way to deal with the first is to question the assumptions behind the COVID narrative and refuse to use language that acknowledges the validity of and reinforces that narrative. Questioning of these can bring the whole tree with all its evil fruit crashing down and expose the government's evil machinations in using this claimed pandemic with its endless on-demand so-called variants to promote fear and compliance and smooth the way to total control.
Now listen, y'all, the only way to stop the violence is for us to break the silence right now. So if you tend to agree and you're pissed off like me, stand your ass up and scream it out loud. Sing, I will not comply. Quit trying to take me to task, cause I don't want to wear a mask or take a vaccine that could maybe make me die. They got no scientific evidence to back that crap up. All they do is feed us lies.